Sam Quinn believed she'd built a bond with something in the ridge, but she vanished after following it one last time. Searchers found the area she stood in violently disrupted, branches snapped high above reach and debris driven outward. Her recovered audio revealed a second cadence shadowing her every step. It was October 12, 2019, in the fog-heavy foothills near Willow Creek, where sound drifted without direction and the forest felt unnervingly aware. Sam Quinn's car was found locked at the trailhead, her pack untouched inside, but her recorder missing. When searchers recovered it 2 days later under mud, it held 5 files capturing hours of movement and something else. Something that had followed her with practiced familiarity. Something she had been meeting for nearly a year. The recordings documented patterns she believed were mutual, exchanges she thought were reciprocal, and a presence that had learned exactly how close it could get. Her notes traced the origins back to late November 2018. She never saw him, but she heard the same pattern behind her on nearly every visit. 3 steps, a pause, 3 more, always 20 to 25 feet back, never closer unless she initiated it. Then objects began to appear, stones arranged, bark placed neatly, only after she started leaving items of her own. She recorded each exchange as part of a growing, deliberate pattern. What changed over the following months was not the scatter of objects, but the precision behind them. Stones she placed were sometimes returned in symmetrical patterns or arranged into small arcs as if following the curvature of her original placements. Lines of bark shavings appeared in narrow columns that matched the width of her footprints. It was not random, it was not chaotic. Each adjustment was subtle enough to be overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the terrain, but clear enough to her, someone who spent hours in each clearing, to recognize intention. The pacing never varied. It remained the anchor of every visit, holding the same distance even as she changed elevation. The presence never approached without cause. It never pushed past its invisible boundary unless she initiated an offering ritual, and even then it moved with deliberate silence. Her logs described that silence in detail, not an absence of noise, but a muted shift of weight accompanied by dense compression of the forest floor. She wrote that the sound carried a heaviness no human could replicate without equipment, but she did not treat it as threat. She treated it as recognition. By late winter, the ridge had become less of a field site and more of a place she believed she was expected to return to. She scheduled her visits around dusk, noting that the presence never responded with the same consistency during morning or midday hours. She began arranging her offerings more carefully, never leaving them in random locations, always placing them on bare patches of soil free of debris, as if presenting them for clear visibility. After several months, she found that offerings left slightly off-center were later repositioned into alignment with a nearby log or stump, reinforcing her sense that the presence wanted clarity in how these exchanges were conducted. Her notes shifted subtly throughout spring. She stopped referring to the presence as it in certain entries and instead used nonspecific masculine pronouns without directly explaining why. She wrote that some evenings felt guided, that certain knock patterns seemed to precede her movement into specific sections of the ridge. A 3-knock sequence would echo from uphill, and she often interpreted that pattern as permission to continue forward. When she paused, the pacing paused. When she turned, it turned. When she rested, it held position. She did not frame this as surveillance. She framed it as synchronized travel, 2 beings navigating a shared route according to an unspoken structure. She described a moment in June when she sat on a fallen spruce and remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, recording atmosphere rather than movement. The presence did not leave. It paced along the perimeter of the clearing in slow, deliberate arcs, adjusting its distance only when she shifted her posture. She wrote that she felt watched, not the predatory kind of watching, but an attention that held her in a steady, assessing posture. In her entries, she noted that such moments felt less like study and more like acknowledgement, as if the presence recognized her stillness as part of their communication. patterns deepened further when she began leaving warm objects, cloth warmed by body heat or jars heated in her pack beneath a jacket. These were always retrieved and on several occasions left in new positions by the next visit. Once she found a piece of bark folded over one of her cloths, creating a small enclosed pocket. She took this as evidence of understanding, though analysts later interpreted it as opportunistic manipulation of material. But Sam contextualized it as nuanced reciprocity. Her interpretations shaped every subsequent visit. She believed the presence was adapting to her, learning from her, responding with its own form of structured behavior. Seasonal rhythms continued to tighten the predictability of their interactions. She wrote that certain locations always initiated pacing, others elicited knocks, and others remained quiet, regardless of how long she waited. She mapped these territories in her notes, labeling some areas as permitted zones and others as restricted. She never clarified how she determined these boundaries, only that attempts to enter specific regions always produced distant vocalizations or heavy branch snaps that signaled limitation. She did not register these as warnings. She registered them as rules in an ongoing relationship she was learning to understand. As summer progressed, the interactions grew more layered. The presence began mirroring not only her footsteps, but her breathing patterns. In a late July entry, she described slowing her exhale intentionally to test whether the pacing adjusted. It did. The breathing she recorded from the tree line became more rhythmically controlled, rising and falling in intervals that nearly matched her own. She believed the presence monitored not just her movement, but her state. This reinforced her sense of personal connection. She framed these interactions as trust-building, as if the presence viewed her stillness and calm as signals that reinforced mutual recognition. Her last complete journal entry, dated September 28th, documented a moment where she found a narrow stretch of ground cleared in a clean, straight line at the edge of a ridge she rarely crossed. The clearing matched the size and shape of a walkway, its edges marked by snapped twigs arranged in parallel rows. She interpreted this as an invitation, an opening carved into terrain previously avoided. She wrote that she had never seen this pattern before and that it felt like a route meant specifically for her. Analysts would later suggest it could have been the result of natural debris sliding downslope after a storm, but Sam perceived meaning in the arrangement. It aligned with her belief that the presence had begun guiding her more intentionally. All of this led into the night of October 12th, when the first recovered audio file began. Light was fading as Sam's footsteps moved through the familiar trail leading into the ridge. Her breathing remained slow, steady, and unhurried. 20 seconds into the recording, the familiar rhythm began behind her, the same measured pattern recorded through nearly a year of interactions. There was no surprise in her breathing. She did not stop or hesitate. She continued at a measured pace, as if expecting the presence to follow. The first file documented more than proximity. It documented confirmation. When she initiated a 3-knock sequence on a nearby trunk, the answering knock echoed from uphill shortly after. The tone was deeper than previous recordings, resonant enough to vibrate through the forest floor. She paused briefly, not out of caution but interpretation. The pattern she heard aligned with earlier exchanges she categorized as acknowledgement. She moved forward after the knock ended, stepping toward a brush cluster, where she knelt and placed an object on soil. The presence retrieved it with sudden efficiency. No buildup, no rustling approach, just immediate repositioning into the space she vacated. She rose and began walking again. The rhythm resumed in perfect synchrony. Her breathing did not shift. She interpreted the retrieval as acceptance, a continuation of a ritual repeated many times before. The recording captured her steadiness as she moved, pausing only when she reached a clearing where she found a deep soil impression. She knelt and traced the edges with her fingers. The presence remained behind her, breathing heavily, but not approaching. Its stillness during her examination, so long as she maintained calm posture. The final sound in File 1 was her goodbye pattern. 3 deliberate knocks. The expected answering knock never came. The silence that followed marked the first deviation from the ritual she relied upon. Silence settled where an expected reply should have been. The absence felt oddly intimate, like a held breath that had nowhere to go. Sam waited the customary few seconds, then counted in her head, then waited longer. The pattern she trusted had unraveled in a single gap. She logged the moment later as a deviation she could study instead of a sign to retreat. She rose, smoothed her jacket, and continued. The pacing returned, but with small adjustments she could not yet interpret. Pauses elongated, intervals shifted by fractions of a beat, and some knocks that once answered her came delayed or from different bearings. As the evening deepened, those micro differences accumulated into a new texture of expectation. Sam recorded each alteration with clinical attention, measuring the time between her knock and any response, noting wind direction, humidity, and the way light bled through the canopy. She cataloged anomalies the way a scientist logs aberrant readings, convinced that mapping the changes would reveal intent. In her notes, anomalies were problems to be solved, not warnings to be obeyed. The presence that had once mirrored her pace now sometimes moved ahead, stopping in small clearings and waiting. A knock sequence would originate from a direction she had not approached before. She wrote these changes down and, crucially, she followed. Where once she had retreated from new noises, now she saw them as extensions of the system they had developed together. The feeling such decisions produced was complex, equal parts curiosity, and the brittle confidence that comes from repeated success. Small reciprocations continued to thread through these uneasy shifts. Warm jars she left were still taken more often than other items. On 2 mornings, she returned to find bark, folded in a way that suggested deliberate handling rather than accidental movement. Once a ribbon she tied to a low branch had been slid a foot along the stem and tucked into a crook, as if repositioned to be more visible to her next arrival. Those gestures reinforced the idea that the presence engaged selectively with what she offered. Each selective response tightened the logic in her head. Give this, receive that. Observe that. Receive attention. The exchange loop had become a grammar, and she had learned to read it. At the same time, other behaviors grew less hospitable. Branch snaps increased on the edges of trails she did not usually take. Low, guttural tones, longer and more structured than the brief rhythms she had cataloged before, rippled through narrow gullies at times she had never recorded them. These sounds were not simple knocks or pacing, they were low-resonant signals that vibrated through rock and soil. She recorded and noted them, annotating their duration and the positions from which they emerged. Analysts later would call these signals boundary markers, acoustic fences designed to delineate access. To Sam, they were temporal markers, cues she believed would help her anticipate safer routes. Her conviction that she belonged in the pattern hardened in part because of the way the presence sometimes accommodated her in almost human-like ways. On one dusk, she stepped into a shallow hollow to untie a bootlace. The pacing slowed, settling into a steady orbit at a distance closer than usual. She felt watched, but not menaced. When she rose and continued, the rhythm warmed into a more patient tempo, and a single stone she had left days earlier appeared nudged closer to her footpath the following dawn. She logged the gesture as an act of attention. These small allowances only reinforced her belief that their interactions had entered a new stage she wasn't meant to question. This idea of being chosen carried weight. It influenced her choices outwardly and inwardly. She began prioritizing the ridge above other obligations in her notes. Entries documented adjusted work schedules, late evening returns, and canceled day trips in favor of nights when the rhythm of the forest felt most communicative. The relationship she had built through repetition was not romantic in tone, but it was personal. She felt recognized by an intelligence that tracked her patterns and sometimes adapted. The familiarity insulated her from doubt, even as the forest's signals grew more complex. The lines of permission tightened into lines of control. She noticed this most in the way her own movement started to resemble obedience rather than collaboration. Prior to that season, she had wandered freely across moss beds and low ridge lines. Later, she found herself checking the angle of light, feeling for the faint undercurrent of pacing that would tell her whether she should continue. When the pacing paused ahead of her, she took it as direction to proceed. When it quickened just behind, she slowed, assuming instruction. In cases where she hesitated, the pattern sometimes reverted to harsher markers, branches breaking with decisive force, vocalizations that carried a sharper edge. Each time she experienced a harsher marker, she logged it as a lesson rather than a deterrent, and then she adjusted her behavior to conform. An important turning point arrived in early October with the discovery of a narrow corridor she had not used before. The passage sliced through an area of dense growth into a shallow bowl, the floor of which was pressed flat, as if a large form had lain there repeatedly. She documented the depression, its moisture content, and the pressure gradients in the surrounding soil. But in the margin, she wrote a single line that betrayed her core belief: he had prepared this place. The entry was both methodical and intimate. Following the corridor felt to her like following an invitation, and when she traced the path beneath the birches, she felt, briefly, less alone than on any trail she had known. As the night shortened, the presence's behavior reflected increased insistence. Knocks that once waited for her now came with a cadence that led rather than followed. She interpreted this as escalation toward deeper trust, the opening of thresholds she had not seen before. That confidence is fragile when based on repeated tolerances. It becomes dangerous if the tolerances are conditional. The first clear fracture occurred not with a violent act, but with a pattern of silence and substitution. One evening, after she left an offering in a small clearing where they often exchanged items, she waited for the expected knock. None came. Instead, she found the offering later shifted to the edge of the clearing and partially covered with a flat piece of bark. The move was precise, almost ceremonial, but it occurred beyond the habitual exchange window and with a slowness that suggested deliberation rather than routine. She recorded the change in detail and labeled it peculiarity rather than alarm. The substitution felt purposeful. She read it as meaningful, possibly indicative of wanting her to approach a little differently. Analysts later labeled such substitutions as markers of altered tolerance, behavioral edits, indicating revised rules. Her interpretations hardened when the presence began to match, in one recorded instance, the rhythm of her breathing so closely that she described the sensation as reciprocal attunement. She kept that note like evidence, a moment where their rates moved in near-perfect alignment. For her, it was proof of connection. For others, it suggested a predator skilled at mimicking to remove her anxiety. Her conviction did not abate. She doubled down on rituals. More precise placement, warmer offerings, measured pauses, and timed knocks meant to test expectancy. The rituals felt like language, and she believed she had learned to speak with him. That belief carried her to the night when sounds led her down into the less-known ridgeline. The calls, if they were calls, came from above and below, from a sequence of knocks that suggested a route carved into the heart of the ridge. She followed the procession of responses deeper than she had ever been, trusting that accumulated reciprocations were proof of continued mutual recognition. The path narrowed. Branches overhead knit into a low tunnel. Echoes grew tight and close. The rhythm of the presence sped and slowed with a precision she read as choreography. At several points, she noted a tightening in her chest on the recordings, a physiological response that had rarely accompanied her outings. Her breath clipped, not with panic, but with acute concentration. She told herself the sensation was part of the exchange, an element of attentiveness she had not felt before. The forest around her gained density, not just of foliage, but of intent. Objects she had left behind earlier were occasionally visible in peripheral glints of moonlight, repositioned in ways that emphasized a path rather than a mere acknowledgement. Then, in the quiet between two knocks, she heard a change in the ambient soundscape. a drawn-out inhale so close that it produced a faint, warm pressure on the microphone. It was the audible intake of breath she had cataloged before, but never so near. Her own breathing slowed reflexively. The kinesthetic response that had once been part of mutual regulation now teetered into a more dangerous intimacy. The recorded inhale halted. Silence ensued. Thicker this time, as if expectation itself had been folded into the underbrush. The absence was not empty. It held the weight of deliberate attention. She moved forward. The next sequence of sounds was unlike any she had previously documented. Branches collapsed in controlled bursts ahead, then behind. Knocks that had guided shifted to knocks that corralled. The presence no longer mirrored or permitted. It directed and limited. It funneled her into a descending corridor of stone and wet soil where the echo compressed into a single, low vibration. She advanced because every lesson she had learned taught her to follow. She advanced because she believed the bond meant being shown. This is where the pattern she had lived within changed irreversibly. The steps that once signified welcome became the metrics of containment. The rhythm that suggested companionship revealed itself as an architecture of dominance. The choices she had made, born of repeated reciprocities, had led her past the point where tolerance translated into permission. The recording devices would capture what followed. Sam could not foresee, inside the rhythm that had been her guide, the exact moment the geometry of relationship would turn to something else. The moment the rhythm turned from familiar to directive, Sam's footing shifted from confidence to strained obedience. Her recorder picked up shallow breaths as she slowed to interpret the new sequence of knocks. 3 grouped impacts ahead of her, 1 behind, then a long pause. She had never documented this pattern, but she treated it as a new piece of the language she believed they shared. Where others might have frozen, she stepped forward, trusting the structure that had always led her deeper rather than harmed her. The ridge constricted around her in ways she had not mapped. Dense ferns pulled inward like curtains. Fallen limbs formed narrow channels that forced her through pockets of chilled air. Each time she hesitated, a heavy footfall landed just off to her left or right, nudging her onward without touching her. She interpreted these as assurances, gentle corrections rather than warnings. Her understanding was shaped by months of mutual pacing, mirrored rhythms, and tolerated closeness. She did not yet realize that tolerance had been conditional. The slope steepened as she descended. Loose shale crackled under her boots, sending small landslides of grit down the incline. The presence followed with measured confidence, navigating terrain that forced her to use both hands for stability. What had once been consistent distance compressed into inconsistent intervals, sometimes 10 feet, sometimes closer. A single exhale drifted over the microphone at one point, heated enough to register as a faint distortion. She paused, absorbing the breath as if it were a sign of recognition, not dominance. When she resumed moving, the pacing shifted again. It no longer accompanied her. It controlled her path. Heavy impacts landed at intersections she might have taken, blocking turns she had used during previous visits. The forest itself seemed rearranged, the familiar trail markers swallowed by disorderly brush, new openings appearing where none had existed weeks earlier. She cataloged these differences in her head, believing she was being guided through a new route meant only for her. The possibility that the route existed for reasons separate from her did not occur to her inside the framework she had built. As she approached a natural alcove shaped by sloping stone, the sounds around her stiffened. Branches broke at precise heights, forming a lattice around the narrow entrance. Something large moved through brush with complex intent, closing distance in some places while withdrawing in others, creating an acoustic perimeter she mistook for protection. She crouched, adjusting her pack straps, and the presence mirrored her shift with a low, resonant inhale that filled the recorder. She believed it acknowledged her pause. Inside the alcove, she found a stretch of flattened earth bordered by fresh breaks in saplings. The soil bore multiple compressions, none distinctly human. She knelt, touching the depressions as she always did. tracing the edges with slow, respectful movements. Her breathing slowed, her posture relaxed. The presence stayed close enough for its breathing to obscure wind noise, but it did not enter the alcove while she examined the ground. She interpreted this restraint as deference. When she stood again, she offered another warm object, pulling it from the inner pocket of her coat. The recorder caught the soft rustle as she placed it on the soil, then stepped back, 10 measured paces, exactly as ritual demanded. She waited for a retrieval sound. For the first time that night, nothing moved. Silence pulsed through the alcove. The absence of retrieval felt like a withheld response rather than a denial. Sam stepped forward a single pace, confused but not alarmed. The next sound arrived with abrupt, decisive weight, a heavy step landing closer than any she had ever recorded. Soil shifted under immense pressure. A moment later, the offering vanished with a single motion, not the smooth lifting she had grown accustomed to, but a rapid, forceful removal. She steadied herself, interpreting the suddenness as urgency within the ritual, rather than a breaking of it. This misinterpretation carried her deeper into the ridge. When she emerged from the alcove, the forest tightened around her. The knock sequences changed position rapidly, one ahead, one behind, one far to the right. She pivoted toward the sequence she believed indicated direction. Immediately, a large mass moved parallel to her, crashing through brush with deliberate speed. The recorder captured the overlap of footfalls, one directly behind at close range, another repositioning along the slope. What mattered was that Sam interpreted all movement as part of the same relationship she believed she had built. Her breathing grew unsteady as she descended onto unstable ground. Water pooled across the corridor floor, turning soil into slick patches that forced her to brace against the rock walls. The presence entered the water seconds later, heavy splashes confirming its commitment to the path she followed. She turned right, thinking the pool narrowed there, and the footsteps cut her off, repositioning ahead with startling precision. The recorder caught the faint sound of her gear shifting as she halted abruptly. She believed the presence was guiding her away from danger. She did not understand that she had been removed from her options. Farther down the corridor, the forest erupted. Branches cracked above her, far higher than a person could reach, then snapped again at her flank, then behind. These were not random collapses. Each break sounded calculated, placed to form an audible boundary. Sam crouched, waiting for the rhythm to reassemble into something she could read. The knocks resumed, low and slow, from directly ahead. She interpreted them as reassurance. She pushed deeper. The terrain ahead forced her into a bottleneck between two leaning slabs of rock. The recorder captured the scraping of her jacket against stone. The presence entered behind her, compressing the space with its bulk. Water splashed under its steps. She increased her pace, boots sinking into mud that sucked at her heels. Several times she stumbled, but recovered, leaning against the corridor walls. She was still trying to follow the language she had trusted for nearly a year. The next sounds on the recorder signaled the collapse of that language. A trunk split ahead of her, an instantaneous break, not the slow splinter of natural fall. Soil rumbled as a large mass repositioned faster than she could react. She stepped back, then forward, uncertain which route remained open. The presence moved into the remaining space with a series of short, powerful impacts. Then came the moment she could not interpret. A warm gust of air hit the microphone, closer than any previous breath. It carried moisture and heat, distorting the mesh cover. Her inhalation followed, sharp, involuntary. The recorder documented her weight shifting onto gravel, her boots skidding. She tried to steady herself. The presence's breathing thickened into a rush of air. The impact followed. The recorder captured it as a blunt, resonant collision, mass meeting bone or fabric or both. Gear rattled violently. Something slid. The device tumbled, scraping across stone and dirt. It rolled, bounced, then landed against moss or soft soil. The microphone angle shifted but continued recording. No human breath followed. Instead, there was dragging, heavy, rhythmic, unhurried. Soil compressed beneath repeated pulls. Branches snapped under weight. The sound receded along a downward slope before vanishing under rainfall and wind. Sam Quinn's presence vanished into that sound. The recorder remained, capturing the forest as it returned to equilibrium. Rain thickening, leaves adjusting, nocturnal movement resuming hesitantly. The ridge swallowed what had been taken, leaving only the mechanical persistence of a device running until its battery died. Searchers recovered the recorder, a torn strap, and one oversized track pressed deep into soil. Drag impressions led downslope before fading on hard shale. Dogs refused the deeper ridge, and thermal scans revealed nothing. No remains were found. The case was listed as missing, presumed deceased. All that survived were the recordings. Months of patterns Sam believed were mutual, ending in a final sequence where the connection she trusted tightened into control. In the end, the recording showed that the bond she believed she was building became real only when he acted on it, claiming her the moment she stepped too deep into his territory.